with Dr. Bonnie Henry and the Public Health Officer of the BC, Dr. Shannon Mcdonald, the Chief Medical Officer for the First Nations Health Authority, and we're going to be joined by Dr. Becky Palmer, who is the Chief Nursing Officer with the First Nations Health Authority as well. Just by way of introduction, let's turn to our First Nations Health Council elder representative to get us started in a good way for a cultural opening, and then we'll do some brief organizing before we turn to our speakers. Cliff Atleo, please.
Always happy to do so. We can initial class is takshit out. No chaksas to qua. With up takshit was close. Ya Why can't you call how it has to be? A theaternas, a theater teachers, a theater quite hard senior, a theater quacken my tapachit so when you could nach quack to mean jama picture books to us. Ja, was a clinic job to miss. Vaccine could teach to up and top of the. Oh, you could shook your knock here to what say. Job that makes the tears I exited. Das shit like crazy, das shit like crazy. That is. Why, guys, you cry was happy. Creator, we thank you for the day. We thank you for life, and we thank you for all that you provide each and every one of us. We thank you for this opportunity to put our minds together and find a good path and how to deliver this vaccine to our people. Ask for your guidance in our deliberation. Ask for your blessings for all of our relatives, wherever they might be. Ask for you lift up the spirits of those that are grieving and the healing hand for those in need. We ask your safety for all, too.
Thank you very much for that, Cliff. I really appreciate that, and welcome everybody. It's a privilege to join you all, and from Squamish Nation territory here in north of Vancouver, and to have all of you joining in your own territories and in the traditional territories of your neighbors. Just by way of a quick agenda update, so I will look to the chair of the First Nations Health Authority and the First Nations Health Council for some opening remarks before we turn to Dr. Henry, Dr. Mcdonald, and Chief Nursing Officer Dr. Becky Palmer for some brief remarks, and then we will open the Q&A panel. You will see as an attendee at the bottom of your screen, you will see a raised hands function, which puts you in the speakers list. And just as a note on that, given the participation. Our practice is to give preference to the chiefs and proxies who are with us today. And I would note that that's often becomes a very limited number of people who get to speak live during these sessions. We will, the staff will keep me apprised of the regional distribution of the chiefs and proxies. And so we'll try to make sure every region has an opportunity to speak. I do see a number of people already starting to put some questions into the Q&A that you'll see down at the bottom of your screen as well. And again, those will be responded to either in the opening comments of our speakers, as well. We've asked them, in addition to sort of the back and forth live conversation that we will have, to the degree that they can, we've asked them to monitor the questions and provide the responses. For those of you who participated in either of our previous 2 town halls, you'll know that that is where the majority of questions get dealt with, and that is a really productive piece of this this opportunity that we do have. Following the Q&A session at 10:25, I'll introduce the chair of the First Nations Health Directors Association, and he will close our session. Given that we are the morning of a workday, we will close at 10:30, and so I just want to apologize early for all those who I can't get to in this conversation as we go through. And so with that, without taking too much time, let us turn to Colleen Erickson, the chair of the First Nations Health Authority, for some opening remarks. Good morning, Colleen.
Good morning. Good morning, chiefs, elders, health directors, leads. My name is Colleen Erickson. I'm the chair of First Nations Health Authority, and I'm calling in from the SICA's territory. And I'd like to acknowledge first the territories that we, each and every one of us, call in from, and thank the people who have endeared themselves to this land since time began for allowing us to conduct this business in their territory. I'd also like to thank Wiccan for his opening this morning. It's always good and reassuring to hear the prayers and the voice of the ancestors, especially during this very difficult time. I would like to thank Dr. Bonnie Henry and our own Dr. Shannon Mcdonald and Dr. Becky Palmer for being with us this morning. And they're here to talk about the crucial issue of COVID-19 vaccines. At this time, understanding the priority process for receiving vaccines and for the processes as you see it unfolding is a topic of many conversations and some anxiety. So they're here to create clarity around that process and give you all the information that you need at this time. The issue of vaccine hesitancy can also affect the take-up on the vaccines, once they become available. So you will hear the science behind the vaccines from Dr. Bonnie Henry, and again, more information for you to be able to make the decision, that in the best interest of your loved ones. And so your thoughts and your, really ask lots of questions and get as much information and guidance that you need at this time. It's a very valuable time that it's very important, and it's good that the doctors Henry, Mcdonald, and Palmer are here, and available with the information for you. So I again thank you for your participation in this session this morning, and I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Let us turn to the chair for the First Nations Health Council, Charlene Below. Good morning, Charlene.
Well, good morning, Wade, for taking time to gather today on this call hosted by the First Nations Health Council. The recent cases, increase in cases on or near our First Nation communities in all regions and our members away from home continue to create stress for our leaders and our health leads. Our chiefs and health leads are working hard to keep our communities safe, and believe to do so, they need timely information. I want to thank our health leads and our staff for all your hard work caring for our people. I'm grateful for the health leads, our nurses within our communities. Your important work is even more important with the rollout of the vaccine. Our leaders and health leads have many questions about the vaccination plans and rollout. especially for our priority at-risk remote and isolated communities and elders and vulnerable people living away from home. I would like to thank Dr. Bonnie Henry, Dr. Danielle Bain-Smith, Dr. Shannon Mcdonald, Dr. Becky Palmer for joining us today to answer your questions. The First Nations Health Council felt it was important to provide you with another opportunity to hear from and directly from our guests today. Dr. Bonnie Henry is the Provincial Health Officer for the province of BC. Dr. Danielle Bain-Smith is the Deputy Provincial Health Officer for Indigenous Health within the province. Dr. Shannon Mcdonald is the First Nations Health Authority's Acting Chief Medical Officer, and Dr. Becky Palmer is the First Nations Health Authority Chief Nursing Officer. Together, they will provide you an update on the COVID-19 vaccination planning and rollout, followed by a moderated question and answer period. The First Nations Health Council looks forward to continuing this work and in doing so, make our communities healthier and more resilient. I would like to also congratulate Richard Jock in his appointment as the Chief Executive Officer. We look forward to continuing to work with him. He will be responsible for the planned strategy to roll out the vaccine to our nations, and we look forward to those plans soon. With that, let's get started. I'll turn this back over to Harold and our first guest, Dr. Henry, to begin this session this morning. Again, Bukstem for your attendance today, and I look forward to the discussion and ongoing support of the work that you do in your nations. Bukstem.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Henry.
Sure, and thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all again today. And I'm going to talk about something that I think is incredibly exciting and is important for us in our journey through this pandemic, in that it is going to give us protection, and protection that will help us get out of the dark cloud that we've been under for a long, long time. I just want to start by thanking Elder Cliff Atleo for his opening in a good way, and to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples here in Vancouver today. So I'm very grateful to be able to speak to you from these lands. So we today is the day that we are going to start immunizing people in British Columbia for protection against COVID-19. And the vaccines that we have that are approved for use in Canada, there's one so far. It's made by Pfizer-BioNTech, and it's a fancy new technology called messenger RNA, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the good news is as well that we have other vaccines on the horizon where there have been large studies done, and the data is being looked at by Health Canada in our case. And Health Canada has very rigorous safety standards for approving vaccines for use. So first, they have to prove that they work, that they're effective, and also that they're safe. So that is the key things that Health Canada looks at before they're approved for use. They also look at good manufacturing processes, so the practices. So that we know that every dose that comes off the factory, out of the factory, it has done rigorous quality control. And those are all posted on the Health Canada website. And as of yesterday, all of the scientific data that they use to come up with the decision to approve the Pfizer vaccine for use here in Canada is posted on the Health Canada website as well. And we can send links to that if people are really interested. It's quite technical, but it is really helpful for us to know that we have a very strong, rigorous process for safety for vaccines in Canada. And we have a long history of that from vaccines from the first vaccines that were available. The other vaccine that is due to be hopefully approved very soon is one that's produced by Moderna, and it is also an mRNA vaccine. And we are hopeful. I heard just this morning, I was on a call with our federal counterparts, that they're expecting that it might receive approval as soon as in the next week or so, and that we might even receive vaccine before the end of this year, so in December, which is incredibly exciting. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because that is very relevant to many First Nations communities and your people. So there's 4 other vaccines that are in the pipeline. They use different technology. The one that AstraZeneca, that you may have heard of, is also in the trials and has submitted data to Health Canada as well. And we're hopeful that it might be approved soon. It uses what we call a viral vector vaccine. So it uses the virus called an adenovirus that causes a very mild cold in many people. And it puts a piece of the RNA from COVID into that viral vector, and that tells our body how to develop the spike protein that protects us from once we're exposed to COVID. The other ones that are Johnson & Johnson and Janssen vaccine and an Anaphylactic vaccine that are a little bit further down the line, but they are also going to be really important. They're what we call protein subunit vaccines. So they actually take a little piece of the protein and help your body recognize that the protein that's on the outside of the COVID vaccine or virus. Anyway, those ones we hope will be available as well. And some of the exciting things about those ones are they are only a single dose. So those are things that we have to look forward to down the line. But right now, the vaccines that we have in play right now are these messenger RNA vaccines. And so you've heard that mRNA word being used quite a lot right now. What does that actually mean? What it means is that we have synthetically manufactured the genetic code that instructs the body to produce the protein. So if we look at the COVID virus, I should have had a picture handy, but the COVID virus kind of looks like a circle with little spiky things on it. And the spikes around the outside are what we call a spike protein. And that's what helps the virus attach to your cells and insert its RNA, its genetic code into our own cells, and then it reproduces itself. And that's how viruses work. They can't live outside of the human body or an animal because they can't reproduce on their own. They have to get inside of us to do that. And what this new technology, it's been around for quite some time, actually. It's been trying to develop the vaccines for cancers, for example, so that it can take the specific cancer that somebody has and manufacture a way for your body to fight that cancer. It's also been used to develop vaccines against Zika. Or at least it's been tried for the last couple of years, about the last decade, to try and develop a vaccine against Zika and against rabies, which is, as anybody knows, the rabies vaccines that we have right now mean a number of shots that can be quite painful. So this would be really helpful if we could develop a synthetic way of developing rabies vaccine. So a couple of things about this, because it takes the genetic code, just the instructions for how to make that protein, it means that you're not infected with the virus at all. You cannot get COVID from this vaccine. And but it also means it's very delicate. So it's wrapped in what we call a lipid nanoparticle, which means a little fat globule. And I've heard it described as having a very delicate glass piece of glass ornament that's wrapped in a whole pile of tissue paper to keep it safe. And that's the analogy that I use for thinking about this. So it's this tiny little piece of instructions on how to make a protein that's wrapped in a coating of lipid or fat to keep it safe. And it's frozen so that it's very stable. So that is one of the challenging things about this vaccine, is that it has to be kept frozen until just before you're going to reconstitute it, we call it, or just before you're going to use it. And the Pfizer is working out, how stable is the vaccine after it's been in an airplane for a while, and then in a truck, and then you handle it. So it's down to the details of when we take it out of the frozen tray. It comes in trays of 975 doses that are in 3-dose vials, frozen on a tray. And when you take the vial out to put the liquid in it, to reconstitute it, you can't shake it because that would disrupt the protective coating around the mRNA and may break it down so that it doesn't work. You have to, you can't stir it or shake it. We're talking like martinis. You have to very gently turn it over 10 times so that we mix it without breaking those little bubbles around the messenger RNA. So that is part of the challenge that we have with this vaccine, is that it needs to be frozen. It's not very stable. We're still working out to make sure we know how to handle it safely. And the vaccine that we have in Canada, we just got 14 different sites across the country received vaccine. We got ours late Sunday night, early Monday morning, and at 2 places. As we're starting out with understanding how this vaccine works and how we handle it properly, they have to be places that have these ultra low temperature freezers, which keep these trays at -70 to -80. So we have 2 sites that have them. One's in Fraser Health Region and one in Vancouver Coastal as a start. So yesterday they were delivered to those 2 sites, and today the clinics are going to start where we're actually going to be giving the vaccine to people. And it's incredibly exciting, and I'm going to be there, and it's actually quite emotional. The things we know, so the Moderna vaccine, which will be coming hopefully before the end of this year, is the same thing. It's this messenger RNA that we inject into our body, and it tells our cells how to make this spike protein. And so our body makes the protein, and then our immune system recognizes it as something different and develops antibodies, and we have what's called cell-mediated immunity. So we have these natural killer cells that are part of our immune system that also recognize this protein. And then when we're exposed to the COVID virus, our body has already pre-developed these protection mechanisms. We recognize the spike on the outside of the virus, and the immune system can bind to that and prevent the virus from getting into our cells and making us sick. So that's the whole way that this messenger RNA works. And the Moderna vaccine is the same technology made by a different company, slightly different. So they have a slightly different packaging to protect their mRNA, and it only needs to be at -20, which is our usual freezer stable vaccine. And it comes in cartons of 1,200 doses. So that needs to be broken down. But the nice thing about the Moderna vaccine is it is stable in the fridge at 2 to 8 for up to a week. So that means we can break it down into smaller numbers of doses and be able to transport it in a refrigerated truck, for example, to a community. So the Moderna vaccine gives us a lot more flexibility. The Pfizer vaccine that we have right now still has to be given at the place where it arrives, because the company's not sure how stable it is if we put it in a truck. And then there's also parameters. Once it's drawn up into the vial and ready to give to people, it has to be used within 6 hours so that it doesn't break down. And so that's the reason why we are doing this, at least this week, in those 2 places to trial run it, make sure we know exactly how we're doing it, make sure we're not going to waste any doses at all, and get a sense of confidence of how we can use the vaccine safely and get it into people's arms safely. So today we'll be doing that in those 2 places. And the reason why we're starting with healthcare workers who work in long-term care is because they can go to the clinic. So when we have the Moderna vaccine, or when we have enough confidence and the company has enough confidence in the Pfizer vaccine that we can take it out to other places and can travel either frozen or in a fridge, then we can take it to other communities, we can take it to long-term care homes. And so why long-term care homes are so important, I think this is no surprise to you. We've seen this that it is seniors and our elders who are most affected by this virus, and particularly when it gets into those communal settings that we see in long-term care and assisted living and in some of our communities. So our primary focus with the small amount of vaccine that we're going to have to start with is to protect seniors and elders in our care homes and to protect hospitals. Some of the people who work with COVID to make sure that we keep the hospitals open and functioning so we don't have outbreaks in hospitals as well. So the first people to be immunized today are going to be workers, people who work in long-term care homes in Vancouver and in Fraser Health, and we have a whole process for identifying people and which are the most at risk, and people who work in the emergency department, the ICU, and on our COVID medical wards in hospitals. So that's what's going to happen today. And then next week, the Pfizer vaccine is going to be delivered to 9 different places around the province and in every health authority. And those priorities, again, it's going to be a small amount in each of the places. So we'll be again focusing on those key areas. And as soon as we're able to move the vaccine, or we have Moderna vaccine, we'll be spreading out to providing it to residents of long-term care and assisted living as well. And from that group of people, so we think that that's going to take the doses that we are expecting to receive in December and maybe early on in January. But after we protect as many seniors in those settings that we can, we're going to be moving on to other priority populations, which include First Nations people, especially in remote communities, because we know how challenging it can be if the virus gets in. You have all done an amazing job of protecting your communities as best you can, but we know right now it is so challenging because the virus is being transmitted so quickly. So we want to make sure we've identified which communities we need to start with when we have the Moderna vaccine. And I say that because of the difficulty we have in packaging and traveling with the Pfizer vaccine. So we are targeting being able to take the Moderna vaccine in smaller amounts to be able to take it to many different communities at once. As well, we have recognized that there is a differential impact of this virus on communities who are living in poverty, in shelters, in some of the areas in our urban centers, particularly in the downtown east side in Vancouver, in parts of Surrey, in parts of Prince George and Nanaimo. So we are coming up with a plan, and we need your advice and support in that. And I know Danielle and Becky and Shannon and I have had these conversations. How do we make sure that we get vaccine as soon as possible to people in those communities, because we know that once you get sick with this, people are more likely to end up in hospital and have severe illness. So those are our priorities, and we believe we're going to get enough vaccine in the first 3 months, so between now and March, to immunize all of that group of people and community seniors who are over the age of 80. And we are also talking about how we can bring that down to protecting elders in your communities without the age restrictions. And so we need your advice and on how to do that, and your advice to us on how to best protect those in your communities who are most at risk. I will say one more thing about the vaccine, in that these big trials that were done. So one of the benefits, I guess, of the fact that we've had a very large second wave around the world has been that these large trials had enough people who became sick that they were able to determine how well the vaccine worked much more quickly than we expected. Because sometimes we expected it would take quite a long time, but particularly in the US and in Europe, where they were doing these trials, many more people got sick, and it became very clear when they So these are done blinded, we call it. So the person giving the vaccine and the person receiving the vaccine doesn't actually know if they're getting vaccine or a placebo. And then when enough people get sick that they meet this criteria that we can tell there's a difference or not, they unblind it. And what both of these studies, both the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine, have shown that they're 95% effective at keeping people from getting sick with the virus. So that is amazing. The fact that we've never had a vaccine against a respiratory virus that has been that good at protecting people. However, there are some caveats. So it wasn't tested in children and under the age of 16, and that's because the focus has been on making sure we can protect those who are getting sick from this virus, and that's mostly older people. It was tested in older people over the age of 80 and had a really good effect, which is really exciting because our immune system tends to get less good as we get older. It wanes a bit. And that means for influenza, for example, people who are older don't mount as good an immune response to the virus, to the vaccine. But in this vaccine, it seems to work really well, even in people who are older, which is great. But it was not tested in children, so we're not recommending it for use in children right now. It was not tested in pregnant women. And so what the recommendation of the scientific review committee has been that it probably hasn't, we don't know yet about the effect in pregnant or breastfeeding women, but we need to do a risk assessment. So if we're very much at risk of having severe illness, or we're in a setting where the risk benefit outweighs it, so then we could offer it to pregnant women. And that's a really important discussion to have with your own physician. Recognizing that the COVID virus itself does have more severe effects in people who are pregnant and can have some effects on the baby. So it's a balancing of the risk of getting infected with COVID versus the vaccine. And the third group of people who it wasn't tested in are people who have immune compromising conditions. And that doesn't mean our usual, my immune system doesn't work all that well because I'm older. It means people who are on certain medications in fairly high doses, some of them for cancer treatments, for example, and people who have medical conditions where their immune system just doesn't work. So that again is a risk benefit. So because it wasn't tested, we just don't know if this vaccine will stimulate an immune response and protect people. We need to do a risk benefit. And this is really important because people who are immune compromised, we know can get very sick and die from COVID. So if they are at risk, again, we need to have that conversation about whether this vaccine is less risky than their chances of getting sick with COVID. So one other thing we're watching very carefully around people's adverse reactions. So there's lots of things that can happen when we get any vaccine or any medication. The most common things that we're seeing are sore arm, a bit of a fever, feeling unwell, having muscle aches for a day or so. So those are things that are fairly common. There were no very serious side effects seen in the large trials, so over 40,000 people for both of these trials. Excuse me, but when you give the vaccine to millions of people, sometimes very rare things can come up. And what we saw in the UK when they started giving the vaccine is that 2 people had allergic reactions, what we call anaphylactic reactions. So they puffed up and had difficulty breathing. So every immunization clinic that we do for any vaccine, we make sure we have the medications that help people recover from an anaphylactic reaction. That's something that we know from some people will have this reaction to the ingredients of any vaccine or medication. So we are prepared for that. Both of these people in the UK received the right medications at the clinic and both of them recovered fully. But we are cautious in people who have reactions, and what they've done is looked at exactly what ingredient it was likely that they reacted to. And there's an ingredient called polyethylene glycol, or PEG, That's one of the fats that helps protect the messenger RNA, and it's very likely that was the cause. So that is in some cosmetics and a few things like that. So we have some very detailed things that we ask people about if they've ever had a really bad reaction where they had to have an EpiPen or taken to hospital and have epinephrine. So we'll screen people out. They can still receive the vaccine. We just need to be very careful about it. And I think I will leave it there because I know there'll be many questions, and I hope I just sort of set the stage for you about the vaccines that we have now and how we're going to be moving ahead with them in the future.
Again, my rookie mistake for the day, talking with my microphone off. Thank you very much, Dr. Henry. You actually have already started to answer a lot of the questions that we are seeing in the Q&A. There is a sense of a bit of an overwhelming number of those, but as we work through the next hour or so, those will get answered. I would say that just a couple quick notes before I turn to the next speaker. Generally, these questions are boiling down to we need more knowledge, particularly about the science. We need more information, particularly about clarifying the access plans. We need a bit more information in terms of when it comes to people actually taking the vaccine. And then we need some more knowledge around people, the whole issue of people who aren't going to take the vaccine. What does that mean for us? And then a number of the other questions are specific supports that communities need to address, to provide the service and the vaccinations to their members, whether they're in the community or dispersed around the province, and that's for both small and large, small isolated communities and large dispersed communities as well. All right, so let's move over. I want to also just acknowledge that we have over 420 attendees in addition to our panel at this point, and I do want to move to our next speaker, so Dr. Shannon Mcdonald.
Thanks, Harold, and thank you to Cliff for his prayer this morning. I always appreciate hearing your voice. Elders, chiefs, fellow health protection folk, acknowledging that I'm on Sayot First Nation where I live as a guest. Always happy to acknowledge the community for allowing me to live here. And I especially want to acknowledge our partners, friends, and colleagues, Dr. Bonnie Henry and Dr. Danielle Bain-Smith, who walk with us all the way through this, and we spend a lot more time together than I think any of us ever predicted. I'm just going to give you some of the really quick numbers from our latest COVID update. I just got one like 5 minutes ago. But the numbers I have are from yesterday, and whatever they are, add 21, because that's what we got this morning. I haven't included them. So as of yesterday, we had 1,551 positive cases among First Nations individuals since the pandemic began. And the numbers of the proportion of on reserve and away from home have been changing. Right now, about a third of the cases we have are people who reside on reserve. That is a larger proportion than we've had in the past. So we are seeing more clusters in community. Right now we have 455 active cases. 183 of those are in community. So one of the things that Bonnie mentioned was the prioritization of First Nations people. And when we started having conversations about decision makers about making First Nations people a priority, one of the things that we used was something called incidents per 100,000 people. So what we're saying is how many positive cases do we have in 100,000 people, and then comparing it to 100,000 people not in the First Nations population. What we do know is that the attack rate, so the percentage of people, is higher in First Nations people, and right now by over 19% in BC. So we know that even though First Nations populations are relatively small comparably, the incidence rate is actually higher. And Another thing we measure is something called percent positivity. So that's the number of people that get tested. How many of them are positive? And right now, we're at a positivity rate of over 8.9%, which is concerning. Our goal initially had been to keep it like around 2. And so we have seen that growing over time. And sadly, we have had now 17 deaths in the province among our First Nations people. And we honor families and communities who have suffered those losses and the challenges they've had in the context of community to remember and honor those individuals. So just to keep it really short, Bonnie and I and Becky are among a group of people who sit on a provincial operations committee that meets every day. I'm also on, and will be very soon, on another call with Bonnie at the federal level. So participating in all of those levels. And most importantly, we've developed an operations committee within First Nations Health Authority, multidisciplinary. We have logistics, we have nursing, we have physicians, and we have Katie Hughes, for example, who's also on the call. So we have people in the operations side, and we're just beginning to kind of get to the crunchy stuff about how things will be distributed, where they will be distributed, where the equipment will be, and our focused on our relationships with regional health authorities. You may be aware that regional health authorities have always been our partners in vaccine distribution. They do that with the flu vaccine and with other vaccines that we receive our supply collectively through them, and work together to make sure that that happens well. And so those are conversations that are happening right now, and maybe I'll ask Becky to speak to those just a little bit.
Great, thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Cliff, for opening us up in such a good way. Very appreciative as well. I'm coming to you today from the territory of the Kwantlen, Katzie, and Semiahmoo First Nations, where I'm a guest on these lands. Very happy to be with you today. So thanks, Shannon. You alluded to the real strong partnerships that are already in place, which will really help support this work moving forward. So our ongoing work with our federal partners, numerous tables we're sitting at, sometimes together, sometimes at different tables, with the same message around advocacy and bringing what's really important, the vaccines, to our communities, to our people. As Shannon alluded to, we're sitting side by side with our provincial partners as well. So the regional health authorities, strong partnership with BC CDC as well, and really leveraging the strengths that each is bringing forward. So our internal vaccine planning team and implementation team is again working alongside partners to ensure we get all those logistics and planning pieces in step. So including having deep knowledge around the care providers across the province. So those that are in your communities that provide immunizations now, really leveraging a strength-based approach. So knowing that there's been really good work done in the past. So leveraging those pathways and tools that we already have in place. And we're currently pulling together all our logistics around what fridges do we have across the province that could house the Rna vaccine that Dr. Henry has spoken about. All of our active immunizers across the province now, as well as what sort of education might be required. And Dr. Henry talked a little bit about that, the fragility of it and making sure that we're handling it exactly the way that it needs to be. So it's an agile group, it's a nimble group. We are, staying attuned to both the science as it's coming forward, but also the planning and logistics pieces. So including a conversation we've had this morning with some of the clinical team around, is there a bit of a traveling SWAT team that might be needed, or how do we work alongside our regional health authority partners where we need to do that? So every day learning more, every day we're getting closer to hearing news around Moderna and being able to roll out an approach that will be alongside you and happy to continue to provide details as we move through this work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I just note the time, and we have till 10:25 before we turn to the closing. We are, again, emphasizing the written questions, because as you submit those will be responded to. And even if we don't get to them during the session, they will be responded to in the notes following the meeting that'll be made available. We are going to look to the chiefs and proctors. We have over 40 on the chiefs on the line as well with us, and we're going to look to them for their questions. I don't see any of the chiefs and proctors with their raised hands up at this point. So what I will do is I'll just look at the Q&A, and Chief Tracy Woods and Chief Christine Minaberi had asked a question in the chat, so maybe I'll call on them to get us started. And then I do see Chief Ignace in the raised hands. So Chief Tracy Woods, if you're available, and then Chief Christine Minaberi, I'll ask the technology host to unmute your mic. If you're on the phone, we have 17 people on the phone. They're not identified, but if there are any chiefs there, you can use, if you're on the smartphone, you use the raise hands feature in the app, or if you're just on a regular phone, you would use *9 to raise your hand. And I see Chief Christine is with us.
Hi
Go
there.
ahead.
Good morning, and thank you for the time to discuss these questions. I've got a number of questions, and I think some of them have been answered through conversation. Just the stability of the Pfizer vaccine and why we're not, I'm wondering if it was rushed to approve that one while we're waiting for Moderna. How is that going to be rolled out to our communities? I think we've answered that. Our council has concern over the individuals that live off reserve. Are they being prioritized? Because if they're not being prioritized off reserve, we feel they're going to flock home to be immunized, which raises risk to our community there. Because right now we're pretty isolated, which has been a good thing for our community. But overall, I think that's the gist of my questions. I have a number of them there, but that's my priority question at this moment. Cookstrom.
So maybe I can start then in terms of was this vaccine rushed? And both of them, the Moderna and the Pfizer, are very similar. They're very similar in how the technology was. So we believe they'll be interchangeable. And the short answer is rushed in the sense of there was a global imperative to try and find an effective way to protect people from COVID, because we are seeing the devastation that it could have. But this was technology that has been under development for a long time, and it really was the global scientific community coming together, and I think very importantly, a whole lot of money being put towards accelerating how these vaccines could be developed, and exchange of knowledge from scientists around the world to try and get a vaccine that everybody could take. So I think we can be very confident. I believe we can be very confident in the science behind it. Clearly, there are things we don't know long term. We don't know whether the vaccine is going to give you immunity for a long time or a short period of time, whether you need more than one dose, whether you or more than 2 doses, whether you need a booster dose. Those are all things that we will learn in time. But in terms of the approvals, making sure that it's safe, that it's effective, and that it's manufactured in a quality way, those are the things that Health Canada has processes for, that they put up and said, this is the bar that you must meet, as they have for every other vaccine. And that was all decided ahead of time. What was shortened was usually they don't even look at any of the data until all of the studies have been finished, until the data has been analyzed, that it's been published in peer-reviewed journals, etc. And what they shortened was the bureaucratic processes so that they were able to receive data and have the scientists look at it as the trials were still going on and as the final information came in. So really it was the shortening of the bureaucratic processes, because we always complain that it can take years for Health Canada to do these reviews. And what they did was make sure they got the data as quickly as possible, that they had the scientists who do those reviews actually focus on doing that, not everything else that they were doing, and still meet that very high standard. So I don't believe it was rushed in the sense of that any of the scientific rigor was missed or done poorly. It really was the bureaucratic piece of looking at the data and understanding it that was shortened. In terms of off-reserve people being prioritized, yes, that is something that we're looking at, and we need guidance from you about how best to do that, to make sure, because it is with the amount of vaccine that we're likely to have, some people will get it before others. So making sure that we are prioritizing people, particularly we know that people living in shelters or in some of our less more challenging situations in the urban communities, but we also want to make sure that we're getting it to the remote and isolated communities as quickly as possible too. So there will be a balancing there, and we'll have to take advice from you on how to make sure we balance those.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So what we'll do is we'll take the next two chiefs with questions, and then we'll come back to the panel just to get a few more questions in as we go. And I would note that I did see Charlene Webb's raised hand earlier. She is with Chief Don Roberts. So if I could just shift the order a little bit, let's go to the north for Chief Don Roberts, and then we'll go to Cookby Ron Ignace back in the interior.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Charlene Webb and Chief Don Roberts here in the Chimchan territory, just outside of Terrace here. Thank you to Dr. Bonnie Henry for the update, as well as Dr. Shannon Mcdonald and Dr. Becky Palmer. You kind of answered some of my questions that I had already, I would first like to look at Dr. Bonnie Henry and pose this question to you. With our numbers rising in the school system, will you be looking at an order to close the schools to resume Zoom teaching to protect our students? Here in the Terrace area, 6 out of 7 of our schools have had confirmed cases. A lot of parents are not given options to support their students to stay home, more so the grade 11 and 12 students. The only 2 options that are given to them is 1, distant ed, and for the grade 12 students, that causes them to fall behind on their credits to meet the criteria to graduate. Option 2 is to pull their students and keep them home until the numbers start dropping, and then re-enter them back into the school system, thus causing them to fall behind in their credits to meet the criteria again to graduate. We are putting our kids and our families at risk by allowing this to continue. I've heard from the students themselves that they're scared to go to school, that the masks are not being enforced in the hallway. There's clusters of people gathering, and the teachers as well not modeling. This causes a great concern because our numbers are rising in the north. And what we've been doing so far has been keeping that curve down. And so I'm asking Dr. Bonnie Henry if you're going to look at an order to resume Zoom meetings for our students, as this is an option is for our post-ed students. All the universities and colleges allow their students to learn from home. That's working. Let's do that for our own kids that are at risk still. So the question I have, Dr. Bonnie Henry, when you're talking about can't shake or stir it, and it's not very stable. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
All right, thank you very much for that, Charlene. Let's go to Chief Ignace for his question, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thank you, everyone here for having this opportunity to speak. And thank you, Dr. Henry, for coming on. I want to point out that, I worked on and had the national indigenous languages passed recently. And here in British Columbia, we have 50% of the indigenous languages across the country here in British Columbia. And as you should know, that the indigenous languages in British Columbia are endangered, severely endangered, and some only have one speaker left. And many of our elders that that hold our language and our knowledge keepers in our communities, especially in my community here, of which we have about a dozen, all have compromised conditions. And you're creating an age barrier of 80 and over. Well, unfortunately, we as Indigenous peoples do not have a great life expectancy, so that a lot of our knowledge keepers are in the lower age brackets of 70 are under 80. And and if we lose them, we're going to lose a great heritage and a great opportunity to transfer that knowledge to the next generation. Has that been taken into consideration? I have got about a dozen of those elders that would have difficulty traveling. How are they going to be prioritized? What is the priority for Indigenous peoples? That I think you have to take into consideration, not just people in retirement homes. We have many of our elders are kept at home. We don't want them to go to retirement homes, so they ought to be given serious consideration. And I don't hear that, and I'm seriously concerned that we're going to be losing the last remaining fluent speakers throughout British Columbia. I think you got to reconsider and reconfigure your prioritization with the Indigenous peoples. As you know, the National Minister of Health admittedly stated that there's systemic racism in the health system across this country. And how are you going to mitigate that? Thank you.
Thank you. So let's go back to the panel to the response to Charlene Webb and Chief Ignace's questions.
So maybe I can address Chief Ignace's question first. And you are absolutely right. And that is our overriding priority, is to ensure that we can protect Indigenous elders, recognizing the key role that your elders play in language, in knowledge, in medicines, everything. So that is what we are working on, Shannon and Becky and Danielle and myself. And we have put Indigenous peoples separate and privileged them in terms of whether, what I said for elderly community dwelling people over the age of 80, but any Indigenous elder, First Nation elder, and we need your advice on how to identify those people in your community so we can prioritize them for receiving vaccine. And we need to bring the vaccine to you, which is why we're using the Moderna vaccine, so we're able to do that. We recognize as well that, so I consider them, we consider them in the same priority as residents of care homes, for example. So that is the analogy that we're using, and we're working out how do we do that in a most efficient and quick way as possible as soon as vaccine becomes available that we can take to people. So I hear you absolutely, and that is a priority for us, absolutely. In terms of stability, which leads into the other first question, what we mean is if we shake it too much, that protective coating, the lipid coating around the messenger RNA could break down, and it would be like, I'm trying to think of, like if you shake your package too much, then the stuff in the inside can break. And if it breaks, it may not lead your immune system to develop the antibodies that you need to protect you. So it's not that it would become dangerous. It just means that if it's not handled properly, the vaccine may not work in people. So that's why we have to be so careful with it. And the type of packaging, the lipid molecules around the Moderna vaccine are slightly more solid, I guess, or protective or stable than the ones around the Pfizer vaccine. So that's why they have slightly different requirements. So they used different types of fat molecules to protect the messenger RNA in the middle. And in terms of schools, the short answer is, all of our data tells us that even though we've had exposures in schools, which means there's been both students and teachers who've been in school at a time when they may be infectious to others, we have very little transmission in schools. And schools are actually a safe place for children across the province, even as we're seeing rates increase in our community. It's more likely that somebody in the school community will have the disease because it reflects what's going on in our communities. But that doesn't mean that they're transmitting it to other students or from students to teachers. We have seen clusters in particularly in the adults in the school community who are more likely to pass it to each other. And what you talk about wearing masks in the hallways and teachers modeling that important behavior is something that is incredibly important for keeping those schools safe. And we know that there's other really positive things that children get from being in the school setting. And maybe I'll ask Danielle to talk about that, because we looked at this in some detail when children were home in March and April, and the challenges that students and families faced when children were at home. And I know Danielle, with her children, has experienced this as well.
Danielle, you're muted. You're still muted.
Here we
the
go.
host-
Sorry, I've been madly typing away and answering people's questions in the Q&A, so I apologize. I just couldn't get myself back to the mute. Yes, I think we mentioned on the previous webinar that children get COVID-19 less frequently than adults, and when they do, the symptoms tend to be milder and they don't tend to pass it on to adults. And so for those things really stand us in good stead. And we do know that, as Dr. Henry mentioned, that school is really important for children for so many different reasons. And yes, I was home with my 8-year-old and 4-year-old throughout March and April and May, and I can attest to, we were one of the families that found that really stressful, and it was a hard time. And it's been really good for all of our family to have that routine and structure and just have that that safe space for learning. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Let's go to Chief Edward Johnson, who has his hands raised. And I do note that Chief Judy Wilson is listed as being in Vancouver Coastal. So we'll go to those two next, and I'll ask the panel to just follow those questions. Chief Edward Johnson. Looks like you're still muted. There you go.
Hello.
Welcome.
Drew na ate Chani o klama klitsnit istakshikla ohed Chief Proxy for MCHI Robert Dennis Sr. for Ohio First Nations. I think my concern, and I liked what Dr. Becky Palmer had to say. I think that as the vaccine rolls out and going to the people that were mentioned, I'm worried about our nations on Vancouver Island, with the increasing numbers. I'm just wondering if there's possible chance in regards to checkpoints, at the BC ferries. I'm just wondering if there's talks on CBC radio about the BC ferries extending their ferry sailings over the holidays. I'm just I'm curious as well as if you have ever been approached, Dr. Bonnie Henry, in regards to the non-essential to and from Vancouver Island, just for the necessary travel, like the just food. I'm worried about our nations on the island, and as the vaccine rolls out and people start to relax, I'm worried about the numbers rising. And I challenge our local nations on the island to reach out to your local MLAs, ministers, people in parliament, and to create some action so that we could look after our people as well as our other nations throughout BC. But, I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks. Chu.
Thank you very much. And let's bring Chief Judy Wilson will be next.
It's good to, I'm not sure if you're seeing my screen. I'm
No,
having
you're not, Chief.
of buttons here on my screen for some reason. But I just wanted to thank all those that put the questions in the chat box. I found them very detailed and informative. And I did make a suggestion that maybe there could be a frequently asked question sheet with hyperlinks to further information. I did see some that were dismissed, and I do agree that even though some people may have opposing views, we should hear from everyone. The vaccines are new. COVID is new to us. So there is a lot of questions people have, and we should always do our best to answer in a good way for these questions, because that's the only way we're going to come to understanding in what we're dealing with. And also because there's what I'm understanding, because I also asked for any health studies, any health trials that had happened, if we could get information. So it would be good to post that kind of information back to our member bands, and that our leadership organizations like the Union, the Summit, and BCFN also be looped into the communications, because our member bands would be asking us questions. Because what I'm seeing in the information in the chat box and what the doctors are saying, there's a limited amount of vaccine, and some of the bands are looking at doing their own self-assessments on who would be eligible, because the concern is the majority of our people, for our Aboriginal people, have underlying health conditions and autoimmune diseases. So that right away, I was saying that there's going to be a limited amount. And I also heard Cookby Ron Ignace speaking about, all of our elders, and not all of them will be eligible due to the underlying health conditions. And the other one is the distance that the vaccines have to go, because you have to keep them in a cold, extremely cold temperature. So there is a lot of challenges, and I see our health organizations doing their best, but I think the communications is going to be really key, because we want to ensure that people are informed and making informed decisions in and around how we're serving our communities. I also included this in my monthly newsletter, but already I know they're going to be coming with a lot of questions. So I'm hoping that frequently asked questions is there. And over the holiday season, I've been telling people, just because it's holiday, COVID will not take a holiday, so we're going to need information, and also after hours linkages for our bands where they can call for that additional support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cookby. And just before I go back to the panel, I will clarify it. In terms of the dismissed questions, it's kind of two things. It's the strategy. One is, if a question is related to a question that's already been answered, then that is dismissed, and we've asked that a note gets sent to that person to let them know that there's an answer in the list of Q&A. The other one is, there's often some administrative questions that get dealt with. So that's what the dismissed means. It's not an effort to avoid the conversation. So just be clear. I also wanted to, just a technical thing. We do have a stopwatch running, just as a reminder. Well, I'll encourage everyone at that 2-minute mark. That's a good time to then really narrow down on your question and to get back to our panelists. Let's go back to the panel for the response to Chief Edward Johnson and Cookby Wilson. And then following that, I'm actually going to draw in Chief Grace George from the Fraser, and then we'll go to Chief Laborde in the Interior. Back to the panel.
I will look at the stop clock too and be more precise. In terms of the ferries, there are there are extra sailings, but that is more protective. And we know that the ferries have had dramatically reduced ridership, and it's not something that we can effectively stop. We know that this virus is circulating in people, and it doesn't recognize where we're coming from or where we're going or who we've been around. So it does make it really important for us to continue to use our layers of protection, both in your communities and us as individuals. We know there's a lot of essential travel on the ferries and that we cannot stop them, and that there's no effective way of trying to prevent people from moving. And we know that this virus comes into our community with the people that belong in our community, people coming back and forth, and sometimes for medical appointments, for visiting family, and for people they need to be with. So we have to continue to keep up our protections, and that speaks to Chief Judy Wilson's comments as well. Yes, I think Q's and A's are really, really helpful. And identifying who in your community should be prioritized. One of the things that we have looked at when we've looked at the data and sliced and diced it multiple different ways is age is the best marker of all of the other things, like the underlying illnesses. So if you have asthma or heart disease or immune compromising conditions, there are very many of those where we want you to have the vaccine, because the vaccine will protect you, because you're more at risk of having severe disease if you get infected with COVID. So it's making sure that we are protecting those who are most at risk, and people with underlying conditions are those prioritized population. But the easiest marker to tell them, to tell who those people are, is age. And for Indigenous peoples, what we realize is that the age needs to be lower than for non-Indigenous people because of all of those other both systemic issues, increased rates of underlying illness for various reasons, much of them related to lack of confidence and racism in our health system, so people don't feel safe getting the care they need in time, and a whole bunch of other factors. So when we say we're looking at community seniors over age 80 for First Nations people, that is much, much less, and we'll be taking your advice on that. But we've been talking between us about even a cutoff of age 60 and above, or 65 and above, as being the highest priority for receiving vaccine as soon as possible. And I don't know, Shannon or Becky, if you want to speak to that as well.
Okay, if not,
There we go.
then, oh,
No,
there you go,
sorry.
Dr. McDonald.
Thanks. And thank you, Bonnie. One of the conversations that we have had, and when I talked about bringing statistics to the discussion about the prioritization of First Nations, one of those discussions was about the number of people that we have in communities over the age of 80, over the age of 70. I'm kind of hoping that it'll be over the age of 60 because I have a better chance of getting a vaccine. But it is very much recognized that we don't have large populations in those age groups, and that chronic disease and other issues are particularly prevalent in our older population. So people are aware, we're communicating those things constantly, and the planning is going to be reflective of what you tell us today. That's one of the reasons we're here, and I really thank Bonnie for wanting to be here to listen to your voices about this.
Let's see if we've got, I noted that from Fraser Region, Chief Grace George had posted a question. So if Chief Grace George is there, I see she's entering now. Following that, we'll go to Chief Michael Laborde, and then we'll check to see where we are on time, but we can get to another question after that. Go ahead, Chief George.
Good morning, everyone. I would first of all like to thank the organizers, FNHA and FNHC, for bringing us all together. And of course, I'd like to recognize your work to date, Dr. Bonnie Henry. I know it's been an extremely long 9 months, and we've been witnessing your journey to date. I'm very grateful for all of the information and support that you have brought forward so far, and for meeting with us, taking the time out of your busy, hectic schedule to come and be with us. So KC First Nation is in the heart of Fraser region, and we have 3 parts to our community in Pitt Meadows, Langley, and Surrey. And so we have, we're surrounded by high numbers of active COVID cases in all parts of KC. I'm happy to announce today that we have 0 active cases. We have 2 members in isolation, and we have 7 who have recently recovered from COVID-19. So it's been an extremely scary 30 days for us here, managing the active cases and trying to contain the spread. And it's been a very long few weeks. My original question was actually about the vaccination, and I think you've kind of answered some of it. I may have missed a portion of my question, or the answer rather, was in regard to if people who have diabetes can take the vaccination. We have many individuals and elders and people of all ages actually that have diabetes in our community, and it's a huge concern for us. My second question is, will the vaccinations go to regions that have extremely high positive cases that surround First Nations communities, such as KC? I know that all First Nations obviously have the priorities, and they're all equally important. I just wondered how the rollout of the initial vaccination would work.
Thank you, Chief George. If we could go to Chief Laborde, and what I'll also let the panel know is I will also invite Chief Charlene Gale from the North into this round, and that'll be the final question, and then we'll come back to you guys for the wrap up. Chief Laborde, you're good.
Thank you, Harold. Just like to thank Cliff for the invocation, and thank Dr. Bonnie Henry, Dr. Smith, and Dr. Mcdonald. Thank you all for taking the time to come and hear our concerns. Most of my questions have been answered already, but there's a few that we've been thinking of. It comes around delivery and logistics. And so Whispering Pines is partnered with Tecumseh, Tessewepnik, and Skeecherson. And so together we participate in the Quimson Health Authority. And there we have our nurses and our nurse practitioners that work for us. So I kind of they want to know what kind of training that they need to do to administer the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. What kind of site preparations do they need? What kind of freezers do we need? That kind of stuff. And lastly, one of our interests is we grow tired and weary of the province hijacking our stuff at the ports. And so we would be interested in partnering with, like, say, UBC or SFU or something like that around bringing manufacturing of these pharmaceuticals back to Canada. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that. So with that, Cook's Gem, and again, thanks for the great call.
Thank you very much. And then let's go to Chief Charlene Gale, add her to this list.
Thank you, Harold, and thank you, Dr. Bonnie Henry and Dr. Danielle Smith. I really appreciate the time that you put in to advise our communities and provide information. Today, my question is that with your orders that you have put in place, how do we address the drug and alcohol addiction issues with house parties that are continuing to happen? We know that these addictive behaviors really struggle with this pandemic, and I'm just looking for your advice. And how do the RCMP play a role in assisting us with stopping this kind of behavior happening in our communities? Currently, we've been advised that we do have COVID in our community, and our council and our health team are doing everything in our powers to try to mitigate this issue. But we find that this issue is still continuing to happen. Thank you.
Back to the panel.
So let me start, and I'll turn some of it over to Becky and Shannon. But in terms of people with diabetes, people with heart disease, people with asthma, people with high blood pressure. Those are all people we know have more likely to have more severe illness if they get infected by COVID. And they are the people who are recommended to receive the vaccine. So absolutely, people with diabetes should receive the vaccine, and in priority with age, as we people with diabetes who are older are more likely to have more severe illness. So that's why we put the age criteria in there as well. So yes, all of those underlying illnesses are reasons to receive the vaccine for sure. In terms of logistics, I'll turn that over to Becky, but yes, there is training, and we are making sure that First Nations health workers are also trained and immunized along with other healthcare workers. And we're looking at how we can make sure you have the equipment that is needed to safely transport and use the vaccine in all communities across BC. And we're working with the Red Cross and DND, Department of National Defense, and everybody that we can to mobilize logistics to do this safely as quickly as we can everywhere in the province. And I absolutely support whether we can get manufacturing back into Canada. We did have one vaccine manufacturer who was in Quebec that was making influenza vaccines, Shire Biologics. It went through a whole bunch of different things, but it was bought out by one of the large pharmaceutical companies, and they moved it offshore. And so we in Canada are dependent on the US. In this case, the Pfizer vaccine is coming from Belgium. And there's a large manufacturing place in Belgium and in France, and a lot of our vaccines come from France. But a lot of them also come from the US, which puts us at risk when we have people that we know are in power in the US right now. So I know the federal government has committed to trying to get vaccine manufacturing back in Canada and vaccine production. And some of the really interesting scientific breakthroughs that allow us to develop these new types of vaccines actually are Canadian inventions, including this lipid nanoparticle or nano particle that I was talking about, the packaging that keeps the mRNA protected. That was developed by scientists from UBC, and it's the company, a Canadian company, a BC company, developed the technology that allowed that to happen. So we do need to support that, and I think having your support would be really helpful for that as well. In terms of, excuse me, and in terms of the challenging question of how do we deal with people who are being challenged not only by the pandemic, but by substance use and disorders and addictions. And those are questions that I don't have simple answers to. I know in your communities, your leadership helps support people. I'm helping to make sure people understand the reasons why we can't come together and have those types of parties, and that it does put people at risk and puts your own family and community at risk. I know the RCMP do have the ability to issue fines, but that's not always the answer to these things. And it is a challenging problem that all of us are facing. And I don't have a simple answer to that.
Any of the other panel members wish to weigh in on those questions? Dr. Palmer?
Great, thank you. And thank you for the important question too around identifying education needs. So just picking up on Dr. Henry's comment around there is education resources that go alongside both the planning and the implementation operations of the vaccination program. And so there's strong clinical connections with the teams across the province, both within FNHA, reaching out to all of the nurses who serve our BC First Nations communities, but also the regional health authorities. So can absolutely rest assured that that support is there, both ahead of the game and in real time. And for the specific nurses, they probably already are connected in with our team, our communicable disease team, as well as our nursing team. But if not, I'm happy to distribute an email as well that they could reach out directly. And they're certainly welcome to join our webinars and weekly phone calls as well, lifting the knowledge base of all of our care teams out there in the field. So happy to connect offline as well. Thank you.
Dr. Mcdonald, final word. Muted. There you go.
Sorry. New computer, I'm confused. I just very much look forward to getting vaccine on the ground in communities so we can get this done, and that I don't have to get those multiple phone calls and emails about new cases. I'm very, very much looking forward to a weekend off and a healthy community. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at the time where we do need to close to the move to the closing and the thank yous. I do want to acknowledge that we couldn't get to everybody. The chiefs will assure you that I bear that burden very often, and I take no pleasure in not being able to get everyone to the microphone. Please note that many of you were able to be responded to in the questions. We had over 130 questions overall. 61 were 65 now were responded to, and that included a number of the other questions that were in the dismissed category that were related. And then as the process goes, the remaining 44 will be continued to be reviewed and will be responded to in the follow-up notes that come from this session. I would also note and thank the panelists myself. The priority today was vaccination, but you can see from the questions that you've asked that our chiefs and our communities and our health directors are really maintaining that sort of broader strategic focus on, let's say, their community safety, COVID safety plans. And so that's, I see you can see that reflected in the kinds of questions that you've got. With that, I do want to thank you, and I do want to turn to Keith Marshall for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Harold. Well, this has been an exciting morning. It's been a lot of good news and good conversation. So I would first of all like to thank Dr. Bonnie Henry for providing the BC provincial update on COVID-19 and the vaccination planning that's going to go forward. To Shannon, to Becky, and to Dr. Ben, thank you again for all your good work. And I heard Shannon say that she and Becky are working 7 days a week. So I hope you do get a weekend off and have some rest. And we're so pleased that you continue to work with our government partners in the planning and designing and delivering cultural safe COVID-19 response for our BC First Nations. Thank you to the chiefs and the health directors for taking part in this important discussion. We understand the concerns that we have in our communities as we were on the ground on a day-to-day basis, helping to protect our communities. We do celebrate the good news that we have a safe and effective COVID-19 vaccination that will begin in the new year or sooner, and that First Nations communities will be prioritized, and those away from home as well. That is very important. And we understand there are some limitations, but hopeful that the new vaccines will make a difference to protect our communities going forward. As we close, I want to remind you that there are still the virtual and emotional cultural supports that are available to community 7 days a week through the Sultan Lalem and the Kikamin Family Development Center, and they can be reached by calling 1-888-403-3123. Please note that it's important that we continue to draw courage and strength from our cultural teachings and values, and also following public health guidelines to stay safe, to stay well, and protect the lives of ourselves and our loved ones. And as we move forward, I'm sure we'll get through together. To each and every one of you, a very, very Merry Christmas, a happy holiday season, and please take care of yourself and stay safe. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Harold.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I would note that in the Q&A, when we got to the live, we were able to get somebody from each of the regions. So I did want to acknowledge that. I want to join in and thank and wish you all Merry Christmas and a happy holidays to our panel and to all of our attendees. Thank you very much for that. With that, I will ask our technical host if, well, maybe we have another minute or two. So Dr. Bonnie Henry, just last word to you.
Oh dear. I just want to say I'm very grateful for the advice and the wisdom that I received from my colleagues from First Nations Health Authority and these sessions, hearing the concerns and the wisdom and advice from the leaders in First Nations communities around BC. And thank you so much for the privilege of being with you again today.
Okay, thank you very much. I do see our CEO, Richard Jock, is there. I want to congratulate you on your appointment, Richard, and thank everyone for their participation. And I will call on the host to close the webinar. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.